I'm Bruce Honeywell, and this is the top end of the Northern Territory. I started out around here working as a stockman and later a station manager. Today I'm still in the same country, but now I make films and write books. I've been researching and working on this film for about a year now. The story weaves together the strange history of a beautiful area. We'll discover a little town that was once planned to be the great inland capital of Northern Australia, and find out what went wrong with the plans that the Northern Territory administration had for this area. Our search leads us to the most beautiful river system of Northern Australia. Along the way are some of the popular four-wheel drive and tourist destinations of the top end, including Litchfield National Park, the thermal springs at Mataranka, and the Roper River. South of the Roper, there's a large chunk of what has virtually become a no-man's land, some of the most remote country in the world. We had the privilege to be among the first white people ever to walk through this country. This is the first footage ever filmed of these intriguing and beautiful spires of rock. My partner and photographer, Tina Plum, and Juliet joined me for part of this trip.
Today, Mataranka is a little town sitting alongside the Stuart Highway, about 400 kilometres south of Darwin. With a population of about 250, give or take a dog or two, it belies the grandiose plans that the Australian government had for this little place less than a century ago. To best understand the great dreams that would make this place a capital city, you need to know just what was going on around here at the turn of the century. It was about this area that a book was written, describing life at the turn of the century. A book that popularised the name of the area, the Never Never. This book was, of course, Mrs. Aeneas Gunn's We of the Never Never. Still one of the best-selling books ever written in Australia, the book became compulsory reading for generations of Australians as a set text. The popularity of this book made Elsie Station and the Never Never famous right around the English-speaking world. At the turn of the century, there was no Mataranka. Elsie Station was some 20 kilometres to the south. Little remains of the homestead today, just one veranda post. And the little cemetery, now a site of national heritage. Here lie at rest the personalities who still live between the covers of We of the Never Never, the Mulligar, the Fizzer and the Elsie Stockman. Bitter Springs is a waterhole close to where Mataranka is today. This was a crossroads at the turn of the century. Here the paths of explorers met. Overlanders rested mobs of weary cattle on the way through to the Kimberley. For Elsie, it was a stock camp, a place to muster and brand cattle. The overland telegraph line passed near Bitter Springs on its long trail between Adelaide and Darwin.
At the turn of the century, local industry through here was a few large cattle stations and the overland telegraph line. This is one of the original poles of the OT line. Travellers used the OT line in those days as a route down into the interior. Today, these poles have either been removed or fallen into disrepair, replaced by modern technology of fibre optics and satellite communications.
Away from the station homesteads and the OT line, this country was very much the province of the original inhabitants, the Aboriginal clans that lived along the Roper River. Elsie Station was taken up in 1881 when Abraham Wallace walked a mob of cattle overland from Queensland. After first settlement, white labour was used on the cattle stations. As the herds grew, the ready source of Aboriginal labour was capitalised. The Aborigines had an excellent knowledge of the country, and their bush tucker skills made this labour source a cheap one in the early days. For their part, the Aborigines soon developed a taste for the beef, flour, tea and tobacco that was part of the white way of life. The white management soon realised the Aborigines were better employed than being left in the bush to raid the growing herds at will. It was into this Northern Territory of South Australia that a newly married couple sailed, Aeneas and Jeannie Gunn. Aeneas had been appointed the manager of Elsie Station. After getting married in Melbourne, the Gunns sailed to Port Darwin. They travelled south on the steam train of the North Australian Railway. In 1901, the old train skirted still unknown, unexplored country between Darwin and Pine Creek. Today, this wild and rugged area of sandstone plateau and cliff-like escarpments makes up Litchfield National Park. The beauty of Litchfield appeals particularly to Tina, especially the patches of monsoonal rainforest that follow the park's creeks. This is a photographer's paradise. There are photographs everywhere, just waiting to be taken. Litchfield National Park is one of the Northern Territory's more recently gazetted national parks. It is only a couple of hours' drive southwest of Darwin. It comprises the rugged escarpment of the Tabletop Range and boasts a collection of waterfalls, spring-fed streams, rugged rock sculptures and pockets of monsoonal rainforest. Many of Litchfield's features can be reached by two-wheel drive vehicle. However, the four-wheel drive is still the ideal way to see the park, as many of the tracks are definitely four-wheel drive only. The walk into Sandy Creek Falls is a close experience of the top end. There is the best part of an hour foot slog into the falls and rock hole. This is one of the more inaccessible waterfalls. Access is by four-wheel drive only. These clear rock pools beneath the waterfalls are above the habitat of the saltwater crocodile and make safe swimming holes. High in Litchfield National Park's plateau, Florence Creek winds through the rocks to make up bully rock holes. Crystal clear water collected in the sandstone scarps of the Tabletop Range flows from rock hole to rock hole. From spa bath to spa bath. This is the coolest way to pass the hot hours of a tropical day. The Lost City is a place where nature has weathered the sandstone rocks into fantastic shapes. The geometry of the eroded rock makes them seem as though they were designed and built by some prehistoric town planner. 8-year-old Juliet must continue with school on these trips, even though her schoolroom is just a little out of the ordinary. Blythe Homestead is a partly restored relic from the early pastoral days of the north, when what is now Litchfield Park was then part of Stapleton Station. This homestead was built by the Sargent family in 1929.
What's this for?
Well, you can see the holes in there.
Yeah.
They would have had bits of wire going back and forth across there, and they would have put bags down,
Yeah.
and then potatoes probably on there. Do you know what they kept it for? In this
No.
country, potatoes go rotten really quickly. And so you can spread them out and let the air get around them, and they can keep them much longer. So this was before the days of refrigerators, you know.
Like,
The old homestead is a good example of the bushman's craft. The structure of the building is made entirely from bush timber and corrugated iron. Litchfield is a place of waterfalls and rugged escarpment. A wild piece of wilderness that has been kept safe for posterity. Meanwhile, back at the turn of the century, Aeneas and Jeannie Gunn were travelling south aboard the old steam locomotive. The end of the railway was then a little town called Pine Creek. The station at which they disembarked is today preserved as part of the Northern Territory's heritage. From Pine Creek, the Gunns had to travel by horse south to Elsie. It's hard to imagine today, travelling on bitumen roads with bridges built well above flood height, what it would have been like for the Gunns riding through this country. After nearly a week to travel what today takes a couple of hours, the party rode into Elsie Station, described as a down-at-heel sort of place, all verandas and promises. At the time the Gunns arrived at Elsie, the Northern Territory was still largely unexplored. Landholders were still a law unto themselves, governed by distant and ineffective bureaucracies. The cattlemen had by now a feudal but symbiotic bonding with many of the Aboriginal groups. This was the Northern Territory as the new century opened, as Australia gained federation. Following the Commonwealth takeover of the Northern Territory from South Australia, Dr. John Gilruth took up residence as the Northern Territory Administrator in 1912. Gilruth developed a grand plan to populate the territory with the right sort of settlers, smallholders who would farm the land with their families. His first step would be to open experimental farms. Gilruth was shown the lands of the Upper Roper. This country seemed ideal for his plans. Thinking the current name for the area, Bitter Springs, was not conducive to his new settlers, he renamed the area Mataranka. Land was acquired from the Elsie lease and was surveyed into farms. Sheep were purchased, and the whole concern was called the Mataranka Horse and Sheep Experimental Station. Gilruth saw Mataranka as the potential inland capital of the North. He believed that as the Northern Territory developed, Darwin would become unsuitable as a capital city. Gilruth held the Victorian belief that residence close to the seaboard was not healthy, particularly for women and children. He became convinced that the neighbourhood of the Upper Roper, the area he called Mataranka, offered the best site for an inland city because of its altitude, distance from the sea, central situation, good soil and beautiful river. Gilruth's hopes were based on the beauty and the fertility of the banks of the Roper River. The waters of the Roper come from two general sources: wet season runoff from the sandstone highlands of Arnhem Land and from underwater springs that ensure the river runs all year. These many springs are found around Mataranka. Millions of litres of warm, clear water bubble into these idyllic pools every hour. The subterranean sources are the artesian basins of the Georgina and the Daly. Rainwater perhaps 1,000,000 years old, has worked its way through the limestone substrata and, under pressure, erupted into the Mataranka pools. In this way, the Roper keeps flowing with clear waters throughout the longest dry season. In the upper reaches, above the upper limits of the saltwater crocodile's habitat, the canoe has always been a good way to get close to the Roper. Here in long riverine stretches, the river is the result of water from the many springs and various tributaries joining in their flow towards the Gulf. Paperbarks and pandanus line the banks, and many species of birds make the cool river home. Water lilies decorate the surface. This reach is at the 12 Mile, now part of the Elsie Conservation Park. Tufa or lime deposits make rapids and small waterfalls as you travel down the Roper. Just upstream from this reach is a sandstone formation across the river, quite different from the tufa formations. This is Mullarak and is part of the Kangaroo Dreaming Trail.
Many, many years ago in the dream time, there were two kangaroos travelling north of the Roper River. Travelling along, and two dingoes chased them. And they came right down here, and the male kangaroo, he jumped from that cliff there, right across here, and he kept going down in the Allawa country that way. But the dingoes caught the female, just there, the mother kangaroo. Well, that female got up, the mother kangaroo, and she jumped from there, but she was unlucky. She got a toe caught right in that cliff, and she splash, landed in the river, and she died there. And according to the Aboriginal story, all these rocks here are her intestines, her guts. But the special part of the story is that when the mother was in the water and crashed down there, a little joey kangaroo climbed out of a pouch, swam ashore, and came ashore right here where we're sitting, and then he took off down towards Salt Creek, and his name was Jajanga. And he went on to do a lot of Dreamtime stories, and this is Jajanga's place, or Jajanga Dreaming.
Jaganga ran down the banks of the Roper to Mataranka Falls. The waters tumbling over limey weirs and waterfalls are part of the character of the Roper River. The geological reason for the formation of the falls is less colourful than the Dreamtime myths.
This is a tufa dam. Tufa is a lime compound, and formations like this are found right along the Roper River. A tufa dam is made when a tree or a branch falls across the river, and over a period of time, the limey compound builds up and builds up and builds up. After several thousand years, a major and beautiful formation can be made, like this one here at Mataranka Falls.
Along the banks of the Roper lies an area of international significance. It is the largest stand of Livistona rigida palms in the world. Territory character and operator of Brolga Tours is Doug Collins. He runs tours down the Roper.
On Elsie, we have what we call the Avenue of Palms. There's several thousand of the trees there. They line both banks for several kilometres. That's the largest single stand of those trees in the world.
Doug Collins shows his visitors Red Lily Lagoon. This wetlands area of some 10 square kilometres lies adjacent to the Roper. It is actually part of the Roper's flow. Several species of water lilies are present. Doug Collins believes this area is unique.
This is a good stand of Livistona rigida palms. These magnificent trees are under threat of extinction worldwide because in some countries they are a gourmet delicacy. This is the end product of the palm, canned palm heart. The trees need to be killed to extract this food.
The demand for this food has almost made this palm extinct in South America. This makes the stand of palms along the Roper River an area of important global significance. The popular face of the Roper is the thermal pools, part of the Elsie Conservation Park and just near the Mataranka Homestead tourist resort. Here the tall liverstoners shade clear pools and walking trails. Above, a colony of little red flying foxes chatter. Through the hot hours of the day, these mammals cool themselves by continually flapping leathery wings. Alan Anderson is the Chief District Ranger of the Roper District.
Main visitation, tourist visitation now goes to the thermal pool, and that's a very small area, and when I say, 200,000 people a year is a lot, and it's put a lot of pressure on the pool. I think by establishing these other areas along the Roper, then we're going to spread the load. In Elsie National Park, there's something for all the members of the family. They could go canoeing, bushwalking, fishing, bird watching. They could go horsetail riding even if they wanted to.
The best way to find out who's who and where's where in Mataranka is a trip to the convivial atmosphere of the Mataranka pub. The locals gather at the bar. Many are Outback characters from the Never Never. Here, the usual wares of the establishment are available: refreshments, meals and accommodation, along with advice on the whereabouts of the district's features. Business can be done in a casual manner, a phrase between sips, and somehow it all seems to work out. Two talented artists run a small gallery in the town. Sandra Fishlock paints images of the Never Never, while husband Des expresses his creativity in leather.
It started off as a hobby when we first came to Mataranka. As the years went by, I tried different ideas using leather. It's a great material to work with. And I suddenly, only last year actually, decided that I would try and create a three-dimensional type creation, I suppose you call it. Now, I don't know how sculptors actually work. They'd probably shudder if they saw this. I mean, living in a place like this, we see lots of things. I see frill-neck lizards and goannas and crocodiles. And this is my latest attempt, but they're getting bigger all the time.
It's not hard to see why the landscape of the Mataranka area inspired John Gilruth. The farms, now surveyed and partly fenced, were ready for the new settlers. Gilruth canvassed far and wide for suitable families. He was disappointed in the lack of interest. On the other hand, the cattlemen were becoming established. They were as hard as the country from which they made their living. They scratched together homesteads built mostly from the materials at hand. It was a harsh existence, the remoteness, the lack of income, fighting the yearly drought of the dry season, and when a few fat bullocks were finally raised, Stone Age taxation was wrought with the spears of the traditional owners, who by now had developed a taste for fat beef. And often the spears were aimed at the cattlemen as well as the cattle. By the 1940s, Elsie Station, now built on the banks of the Roper, had become part of the establishment of the Australia-wide squattocracy. We of the Never Never had made Elsie known around the world. There were several visits of royalty to this outpost of the empire. The Tonneman family owned Elsie from 1914 to 1959. During the 40s, the station was under the management of Harold Giles. Aboriginal labour was a plentiful resource in those days, and Giles' management, while by today's standards a little paternalistic, was then seen as efficient. Aboriginal staffers, male and female, were dressed uniformly for special occasions. Today, Elsie Station is owned and run by the descendants of these workers, the Aboriginal people of the Roper River. These days, bitumen roads and modern communications make life on cattle stations of the Territory much easier. It's difficult to understand in this isolated country just how hard it would have been establishing a station with nothing other than what could be carried on a team of pack horses or maybe a horse-drawn wagon.
There's some station ruins I know, some relics that are frozen memories of old times. A Roper pioneer, Jimmy Gibbs, set up St Vincent Station and left it without ever using a motor vehicle. The station died before it could develop into one of the green garden modern homesteads, where the roar of a 240-volt generator and bristling communication towers are part of life. It's impossible to get a feel of what it was really like.
The trip to Roper Bar is easy, but after this outpost, conditions deteriorate. The storms of the wet season are with us and make some of the going interesting. Detours need to be found around black soil tracks made impassable by small storms. At a creek crossing, it always pays to walk the watercourse first, particularly after rain and when the banks are as badly washed out as these. This country is so isolated, even the wildlife doesn't scurry from our invasion, as would happen closer to civilization. Queensland Crossing is on the Hodson River. This natural rock bar is on the old Queensland Road. The track followed by drovers, miners and settlers heading for the Territory before the Stuart Highway was built. Near here are ancient petroglyphs. These rock carvings were made by the Aborigines perhaps tens of thousands of years ago. The chiselled shapes reflect matters of importance to the people who made them. Animal tracks. mythological six-toed human footprints, and signs whose meaning is veiled in time, meanings of religion and the centre of the individual's known world, the waterhole or camp. The track follows Mountain Creek and comes to a broad waterhole. This is not far from our destination of Old St. Vincent's. This waterhole is a source of an Aboriginal myth. The story goes that at one time 2 couples lived near here. They wouldn't follow the moral values of their group. The relationships they were in with each other were wrong way. They broke the all-important marriage taboos. They wouldn't heed the advice of their elders, and this attracted the wrath of the gods. One day, a rainbow, the huge snake creator, came forth from this very waterhole, and with a breath of fire, incinerated the erring couples. This myth has been used to this day like a biblical parable to assist in keeping secure the Aboriginal cultural values.
I leave the Rainbow Waterhole and keep travelling. I've been to Old St. Vincent's before, in the 60s, while mustering from Roper Valley. Back then there was a grove of mango trees, a set of cattle yards and a spring flowing with cool, clear water. The place has changed. Nearly 3 decades of bushfires have scoured the country. The mango trees and cattle yards have gone.
But the homestead slab is still there. The remaining iron artefacts tell the story of an old station. There are no parts from motor vehicles. All these pieces of iron are from horse-drawn wagons or saddlery.
This old spring cart wheel has had a second life at St. Vincent's as a spreader for curing greenhide. Flimsy though these relics are, to me they should somehow be preserved, as they reflect a time that has passed and is increasingly hard to capture.
The spring is still running, although clogged with humus. When cleared a little, the water is still sweet and drinkable. Permanent sweet water was an important factor in selecting a homestead site in the days before bores and dams. Bruce carries a satellite navigation system, a GPS. A reading is taken at St. Vincent's. It will be helpful in setting a course to wild, unmapped country far to the south. A helicopter has been booked and is scheduled to make a rendezvous the following day.
I'm probably 4 or 5 hours from Mataranka. In the days that Jimmy Gibbs lived here, civilization was at least 4 or 5 days away by horse. Simple things like a broken leg or fever suddenly take on a potentially fatal aspect.
With Old St. Vincent's located, Bruce camps and the next morning makes the rendezvous point for the helicopter. The helicopter is late. This is dangerous, as it is storm time, and no one wants to get caught out in a helicopter during a top-end storm, particularly over unknown country. The chopper arrives carrying Conservation Commission Ranger Alan Anderson, a long way from the green Livingstone stands on the upper Roper. Alan is keen to be involved in preliminary assessment of this country that could be part of a future national park. Taking off with a southern bearing, the helicopter skims the sparse country. Open, semi-arid savanna changes to lancewood-clad ridges. Dave, the pilot, tries to get a weather check, but can't make contact because of the storms. The lancewood ridges change to broken rock formations, an indication that the sandstone column country must be near. The flight path is ambushed by a fast-moving tropical storm. Dave temporarily loses his way. The helicopter loses efficiency in the rain over this unknown country.
It'd be a lie to say we found the spy country without any problems. Coordinates had never been taken for this area. That's one of the jobs we had to do with the Pyxis. After setting a series of sweeping grids, we came to the country of the sandstone columns. The helicopter put down amongst the spinifex. We stepped onto the sandy country that rarely, if ever, had felt the weight of human feet. Human feet with shoes on, at any rate.
The first job is to establish coordinates of longitude and latitude.
We had only a couple of short hours to take a look at the place. The sandstone spires towered overhead. The feeling was like being in a cathedral. Here is country without the touch of mankind. It's pristine. There's a feeling of purity that I find hard to describe. It's different.
This country is unique, not only by the distinctive Gulf country rock shapes, but by the fact that it remains some of the most pristine country in the world. It has never been overgrazed like similar country further to the south. It has never had a botanical or zoological assessment.
This is a delicate and beautiful ecology, and should be protected for what it is, an environmental time capsule of what this country was like before white settlement.
Meanwhile, back in history, Administrator John Gilruth's plans for Mataranka were not going as well as he would have liked.
Gilruth was certainly a visionary in his plans for this area, but in spite of his enthusiasm, the farms failed to attract the right sorts. In fact, they didn't attract many takers at all. His plans fragmented as the harsh conditions of the long dry seasons coupled with the heavy rains of the wets. This isn't sheep country. Those animals couldn't survive. In the end, the project was deemed a failure.
The railway came to Mataranka in 1928, and Mataranka was finally declared a township. Other than a brief population explosion during the Second World War, Mataranka remained nothing but a quiet little sighting in this remote area. And then, in the 70s, even the railway died.
This old sheep dip is just about the only remaining relic of Gilruth's dreams. This is an old meat bucket handle. Hand beaten for a good grip. Handmade when this was the land of lots of time.
The dip has been rebuilt over the years for use with cattle, and today, as it is in a conservation park, even the cattle have gone. So this is the little outback town that time and civilization almost forgot. But Mataranka lives on, with as many visitors to the thermal springs annually as visit Uluru. Perhaps Gilruth's dreams were not so far from reality. What is this place going to be like in another 100 years? Perhaps it will yet become, one day in the future, the North's great inland city. Perhaps Gilruth just didn't allow enough time in this land of lots of time. This Never Never Land.